COVID. So the big thing that I'm seeing very frequently is people are talking about, well, cases are skyrocketing again, which we should talk about, but the case fatality rate is actually flat or down, which is interesting. And I think we should talk about what the meaning is. In one sense, I don't understand why this surprises anybody. We botched the lockdown, and having botched the lockdown, the second wave was absolutely predictable, and many of us predicted it.
So let's just say, I think probably all the viewers and listeners will understand this, but when we are saying we in this case, we're talking very much as American citizens, of the United States of America, not across, for the most part, the rest of America, and certainly not across the rest of the world. The United States uniquely fucked this one up.
Really bad. Yeah. Really bad. And in some sense, worst of all possible worlds, because what we did was we went maybe 70% of the way to an effective lockdown, which caused everybody to grow thoroughly tired of it and many people to rebel against it without getting much of the benefit at all.
Just enough to destroy large sectors of the economy, to impinge on everyone's mental health, many people's physical health, and to make everyone so exhausted with the thing that it is at least one, for sure, of the factors that led to the protests that then became riots in the streets starting in the beginning of June.
Yeah, and it also, maybe you could argue that this is actually a positive thing, but it revealed the double standard that exists inside our sense-making apparatus, where everybody was demonizing one set of protesters and giving another set of protesters a pass for being out there and not social distancing. Now, of course, we have to put this in context. Those protests occurred outdoors. Outdoors appears to be relatively safe for the moment. We have predicted that that will decrease over time, but for the moment, outdoors seems to be a safe environment. Now, of course, as we've talked about before, we don't know if it's safe during the day because of UV light or safe all the time due to the volume and airflow and therefore never crossing the threshold of viral load that makes people sick.
Well, I think we actually pretty well know that both of those things are protective, do explain part of why it is so much safer as to almost be actually completely safe to be outdoors during the pandemic. That increased airflow, because density of viral load is completely predictive of whether or not you get infected and also of how sick you get once you do get infected, both of those things. And also it's true that sunlight does destroy this particular virus as it does many others. So we would expect that there will be some less protective effects of being outdoors at night, but that those effects will certainly not disappear entirely, because I don't have a sense of those two factors, and I'm sure there are more, but of those two factors, basically increased airflow being outside and sunlight being outside, which of those, if I had to put percentages to how important they are, I don't honestly know.
Well, here, I'm going to do my famous English to English translation service.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, that's usually my job.
Right.
Yeah.
It's also your famous English to English translation service. So in this case, what I would argue is that we have a model, and we should all be building models based on what we understand. And our models were really cruddy at the beginning of COVID, and we were all so worried about washing our hands and touching surfaces, which is important, but it turns out for this particular virus, it's not nearly where the game is. The game is all in this other realm, or almost all. The key, though, is for reasons that are yet to be fully articulated, you have to cross some threshold of the number of viral particles that you encounter. Immune systems with a non-specific response seem to be able to deal with some number of these things. And so a conversation of a minute or two, even with a sick person, is unlikely to cross that threshold. A 5-minute conversation is much more likely to. A 5-minute conversation in an enclosed space that captures all of those particles so they're all unable to diffuse away makes it even worse. And if you're outside, you got to think, you've got a bucket that you're filling with viral particles, and if you cross the top of the bucket, you get sick, but the bucket is being emptied by the UV light, which is killing viral particles at some rate. So the bucket is
by the airflow.
Well, the airflow means that the bucket isn't filling very fast because they're diffusing away. And they're also dying, right? The UV light is killing them. And so those two things are removing these things.
Yeah.
It's the concentrating environments that make you much more likely to get sick, and it's the environments that dispel or kill these things that make it much less likely for you to catch it.
And people are both so poor at understanding these nuances and being educated so badly by the media and by scientists that for the most part, we are falling into, as I've been saying since almost the beginning, these tribes, these star-bellied sneeches and sneeches without. And so we see now when we go out that there are people wearing masks, and in the state of Oregon where we live, it is now mandated to wear masks inside, and outside, and there's a new twist to this as of yesterday, but outside, mostly people are not wearing masks, which is a legitimate move. And yet you can also see in the eyes of people that they are judging you and assuming that if you're not wearing a mask, you're one of those people who doesn't ever want to wear masks. And that's not to say that any of us want to be wearing masks, but understanding the necessity of wearing masks when you're inside with strangers is very different from imagining that mask wearing every time you leave your home is necessary. So let me say that on Nextdoor, which is this app that will be familiar to many people, it's this sort of neighborhood connection device. Just yesterday, we had someone in our neighborhood post with regard to a several 100-acre park that's very near us. I walked in the state park today and I was disappointed that 50% of people were not wearing a face covering. If people can't or won't wear a face mask, she wrote, they should not use trails. It is selfish and reckless to not wear a face covering on a trail. Please walk on neighborhood streets instead. Now, I responded for the first time ever on Nextdoor, carefully and respectfully, and got many thanks for it. And the original post has since been pulled down. But again, this points to the lack of nuance in someone's understanding. And one of the things I said in response to her was, we should not be imposing rules that are neutral or even unhealthy for people, certainly unhealthy for people with, everyone is suffering some mental health effects from this, months-long lockdown now. And some people with physical problems are going to be impaired if they have to wear masks, will not therefore go outside if they have to wear masks to do so, and will be further impaired as a result of that. And imposing bad rules on people is going to make many good people less likely to follow all rules, which includes not just the bad ones, but the good ones as well. That is the opposite of what we want.
I totally agree with this, and I probably experience it a little bit less because my version of a mask sends
visible.
Some sort of signal,
Yeah.
but still not wearing it results in people, even when I know that my model is quite good and it's actually based on data in as much as we have that.
Yeah.
There is a sense of like, oh, you're one of those anti-mask people. And
let me just remind people who have been tuning in more recently that we started these live streams on March 24th. And our very first one, we talked about masks. This is before the WHO, this is before the Surgeon General had said, oh, oops, sorry, our bad. That was actually a political move, not a scientific one. It turns out masks are useful after all, we just have a shortage. So we were advocating for this before the mainstream was.
If anybody's pro-mask, it's us. But I think, I really want to emphasize what you just said. I've landed in exactly the same place, which is that there is a missing category here, which is, okay, that person's anti-mask. They're not wearing a mask even in close quarters. Okay, I do think that there's some shame that belongs there unless there's a very good reason that they're not wearing it, right? And then there's the pro-mask people who are now broadcasting that they're pro-mask in circumstances where you should take a break and you should not be wearing your mask because you need a break. Yep. And then there's a third category, which is people who are operating a high-quality model of the infectious problem here, and they are using their mask accordingly. Right. And so that category needs not to be shamed by the always pro-mask people, even if they're going to be always pro-mask. And, I've heard at one point Joe Rogan, he was in comedy mode and he was joking about people who drive around with their masks. And it was funny. But I also know I have, especially in the early days of this, driven around with my mask, not because I was afraid in the car alone that I was going to get an infection or that it was going to blow in the window, but because before we understood that so much of this is airborne and it's not really about surfaces, there was a question about touching your mask in order to pull it up and take it down. And so, if you had two stops that were close together, or if your mask is comfortable enough, then the point is, you just leave it up. It's not that much of an imposition. So somebody with a sophisticated model should not be shamed by anybody.
Yeah. So, and yet here we have in Oregon where indoor mask use in any public space is required as of, a week or two ago. And as of, I think it might be tomorrow, but the order came down yesterday, wearing masks outdoors is required by law at risk of fine if you cannot socially distance by 6 feet. Now, there's a lot in that caveat, of course, if you cannot socially distance by 6 feet. But to this woman's concern about people going out into nature and hiking several miles without a mask on trails where they may at some point cross paths with someone else, no, you should not have to wear a mask then. You should not have to be wearing a mask while you're hiking several miles in hundreds of acres state park.
Right.
Absolutely, it should not be the requirement. You should have one with you.
Most state
at
parks.
At this point, unfortunately, it's become a thing that everyone needs to be carrying with them. Your key, an ID, probably some method of payment, and most everyone has their damn phone on them. But a mask is one of those things you need to have with you if you're going out into public. But do you have to have it on your face when you're outside for the most part? No, you should not. And I worry that this new order from the governor of Oregon suggests a creep towards anytime you leave your home, you got to wear a mask.
Right.
Which is going to then send the already huge mental health crisis that is looming, and relatively small, I think, yet physical health crisis that is looming. That is going to tip that into a giant physical health crisis, because lots of people who are still able to run and bike and play tennis and hike won't do so if they have to wear a mask. They may not be able to. It may just be the thing that pivots them from, okay, I'm going to get over myself, my activation potential, I'm going to do it, to I'm just going to stay home and eat chips. Right? It's going to be the thing that makes a difference.
And the damn clock is ticking.
Yeah.
Right? It's time. If you're going to hike, if you're going to bike, this is the moment, right? We've got a limited number of months to do this. And the kicker here is that the vitamin D connection suggests actually you better make vitamin D while the sun shines, right? Which means if you're being held back by anything now, the cost is later. What does the cost come in terms of? COVID risk, right? Are you going to get it, and how bad is it going to be? So that you want to build up in the bank vitamin D so that when you are faced with winter, you're in much healthier condition from the point of view of resisting an infection. So we got to get this dialed in, and we just don't have it, right? We're really screwing up the there's just too much rule of thumb. Right.
There's too much rule of thumb, and there's too much politicizing of it, right? It's become a political issue, and we definitely have President Trump to thank for that to a large degree. Someone who goes into public and refuses to wear a mask even when everyone else around him is doing so, which happened at least a few times in May, if I remember correctly. Creates a model for his supporters that says something like, if you're a real man, you don't wear a mask. Well, sorry, no. The virus doesn't care what your political position is, as we've said many times before.
Yes, and then there's the next phase, which is that for a long time, this intentional conflation with flu, right? This is flu-like. Maybe it's a little worse than the flu. Maybe it's worse than the flu for people who are very old. No. This is a desperate misunderstanding of the virus we face. And I was going to encourage people. Hey, Zach, do you want to put up that subreddit that I gave you? I didn't know the subreddit existed, although in retrospect, I should have thought that it might. This is a subreddit of people who have tested positive. You want to scroll down a little bit? Let's see. Keep going. Stop. Up a little bit. Okay. Here's one of many, many horror stories, right? I'm only 21 and I don't think I'm going to make it. Now, here's what you will find if you search this. And this is beginning to be dealt with in the mainstream press as well. Not the super big papers, but the press is beginning to catch on to the fact that there is a lot of life being lost in people who recover. Right? That the point is you get back from the flu, and actually I would argue that you probably have knocked some of your longevity off, but you recover more or less fully from the flu. People are dealing months out with the most terrible, mysterious kinds of symptoms because, as they describe it in this forum, accurately, this is a virus that attacks vital organs, right? Yeah. It attacks your circulatory system. It creates blood clots. So the point is the list of symptoms is huge, and the ongoing hazard to you is also very large.
And we've known for months there have been stories of respiratory reduced function after recovery from COVID, but the cognitive function being less in many. I have not seen the scientific paper that relates this yet, but many journalistic accounts and other anecdotal accounts of people who say they have brain fog. They're unable to find the kind of thoughts and motivation that they are accustomed to having and that they had before they were infected. Now, of course, some of that, with regard to motivation, many of us, I would say all of us, have been affected by lockdown, and you cannot predict in advance what that will do. But people reporting that post recovery, they don't have the same brain they recognize from before tells us exactly as you said, and as we said back in one of the episodes 1 through 18 when we were largely focusing on this, that just looking at deaths is a really reductionist way to assess what the damage from this virus is.
Yes, it misses because the point is, if you have a decade or two knocked off your life by virtue of the damage done to your internal organs, you want to count that. The fact that you didn't die in the hospital is not the sum total of the story.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about why people are dying less. And why I would say, if we didn't explicitly predict it, it was implicitly predicted by many of the things we said. The fact is, you have a brand new virus. It is spreading like wildfire, and doctors are seeing it in large numbers, right? Those doctors are fielding it best they can based on the next nearest phenomenon that they know. And a lot of it turns out to have been counterproductive or ineffective, and they learned, right? They may not even fully understand what they have learned. Some hospitals may have learned better than others, but doctors in contact over the internet will have exchanged information, and they are getting better at dealing with COVID patients.
And we highlighted early on in late March and early to mid-April, for instance, a few doctors saying, "I'm not sure ventilators is the right way to go. This doesn't look like that kind of disease. Why have we formulated it that way?" And this to your point that it could well be that in fact care for people with this disease is simply getting more effective.
Care for this will get more effective. It will continue to get more effective. Another thing that happens is evolutionarily hosts get less affected by disease. Now, the evolution that accounts for that is primarily on the host side. Mm-hmm. The virus may also have an interest in not damaging the host so much that it doesn't walk around and spread it. But nonetheless, there's also evolution. So in this case, probably there hasn't been enough death yet to account for this. But the idea is, what if you had some fraction of the population that was spectacularly likely to contract and die from this virus by virtue of some molecular feature of its cell surface or something like that? Then a lot of those people would have been caught in the first wave. That means that those of us who remain are in the category, we are more likely to be in the category of people who aren't quite that vulnerable.
So can I do one of these English to English translations here?
Wonderful.
Yeah. So really just to exactly restate what you just said, but there will be some range of effects for any pathogen. And, let's just make up some numbers here. Maybe 20% of a population will be affected very badly and die no matter what. And another 60%, there is some range of possible effects. Maybe 20%, have almost no symptoms at all. And those numbers are not reflective of what's going on with COVID. I just made up some numbers. But when the pathogen first starts to hit a population, everyone in that 20% who is infected will die. And those people are then no longer in the population. And so you will see that 20% shrink and shrink and shrink over time, such that what the original numbers were will change, and therefore the CFR, the case fatality rate, will change as well and will decrease.
Yeah. So don't be misled by the CFR dropping thing that we were being told a more dire story than we actually have on our hands. This is actually quite dire. And if you think it's not, I would encourage you to go to that subreddit and look at the story after story of people dealing with terrible symptoms that you just really don't want to have to deal with. And I must say, even though I think we are incredibly conscious and vigilant about this, I even spooked myself reading this stuff. It was like, wow, do you just not want to be in these people's shoes? And, I hate to say that because I don't want to add to their burden. We're distancing ourselves from them. But wow, they are a cautionary tale. And we ought to be thinking very carefully, just as you and I have said. In some sense, we just have game theory problem after game theory problem. And one of the game theory problems here is that, okay, the U.S. screws up its COVID response. Okay, the U.S. is now a petri dish in which COVID is now learning new tricks, and the rest of the world is going to have to deal with the downstream effects of our botching the lockdown.
Yeah, the rest of the world does have to, although now Americans can't even go anywhere. Like, there are only a handful of countries, I don't remember, maybe it's something between 10 and 15, maybe, a dozen countries-ish, where Americans are allowed to travel at the moment. And it's Mexico, and it's basically a smattering of island nations in the Caribbean. You can go to Ecuador with a 14-day quarantine on the other end. But pretty much, I think, all of Europe, all of Asia, all of Africa are off limits. And this is new for Americans, right? We are accustomed to being able to go wherever we want. It's easy to get visas if you need visas at all. And the rest of the world has looked at what we've done and looked at what is happening now and said, nope, we, rest of the world, largely did a far better job than you did, and you and your infection are not welcome here.
Right, which is scary because, there are a lot of things that could happen going forward. One of them is we could be 4 years out from a vaccine if a vaccine is even conceivable here. And I do think a vaccine is likely, but, the best experts in the world of vaccines are not hopeful about one in the next year. Right? That's not to say it's impossible. I have seen some stuff that's hopeful, but there's also hype, and it's very hard to separate those two things. So How long exactly are we going to go being unable to travel to the rest of the world, right? That's an entirely different set of costs that we're going to start paying, and it's going to have profound economic implications. So, anyway,
and for those of us, for some of us, and it's a small effect in the global list of effects, but have tremendous mental health effects.
Oh, tremendous mental health effects. But look, we're talking about a world we did not prepare for. Right. And one in which we cannot travel to other places. There are things that require travel. And so there's a question, which is really, okay, we just got slapped, right? Yeah. We learned a lesson, which is that bravado stuff was not going to get you through this by virtue of just, bucking up and letting some people die. And, we'd get to the other end and herd immunity and all of that. We're facing a renewed nightmare. And a renewed nightmare that we now have, in some ways, fewer tools to deal with because we've already blown one lockdown. And so whatever we need to do now is less palatable to us. And
so what if we had done, you proposed this probably 1st of May, okay? Most of America had already been in some form of lockdown for, 5 or 6 weeks at that point. And you said then, 1st of May, everyone is already exhausted. You said what we need is an actual full lockdown for 6 weeks everywhere. That would clobber this virus, and then we could actually reopen.
Well, it would clobber it if you then followed up properly.
Yes. Okay. And so if during those 6 weeks you were generating tests and mass producing tests so that at the end of lockdown, you could do active test and trace and actually know who was sick and who wasn't, and not have this sort of smattering of half-assed tests with high failure rates and not enough of them and no tracing. Simply a full lockdown wouldn't have been sufficient, but we did not have an appropriate lockdown. And even when you said this, I something like May 1st, not here, but privately at our dinner table, my reaction was, people won't do it. It's already too late. It's already too late to convince people. And that was now over 2 months ago.
Right. Oh, yeah.
We would have been long since past that if we had done it then.
Yeah.
So, and this is exactly a mirror for Unity 2020. Just wait until 2024 when things will be better? You think it'll be better by then? It's not going to be better. Yes, it's already too late, but it's only going to get more too late.
Yes, it's only going to get more too late I like that formulation. I think we should adopt it because its clumsiness exactly reflects the clumsiness of our stupid situation.
Yeah.
But the fact is now we need a real lockdown, and
there's no way to do it.
Well, I'm sorry, friends. We gotta. I hate to say it, but I don't know that we have another choice because I mean, this sort of bleeds into the next conversation that we're going to have, but,
Let's do it.
We've got a question about school
Oh, man, do we?
What to do about it upcoming. And, there's nuance here. The very young kids seem unlikely, even if they catch it, to transmit it. So there's talk of letting kids in grade school go back, but not high school.
Yeah, I've seen some proposals, and these things are changing daily, such that even what I thought I knew yesterday, I can no longer find online. But the conversations in American schools seem to be sort of trending towards. There have been very few, if any, cases known to have been transmitted in elementary school, and elementary school children, so therefore don't seem to transmit nor get infected. Middle schoolers more so, high schoolers more yet, and so there have been proposals to do things like totally virtual schooling for high schoolers, at least through January 2021, some kind of hybrid system for middle schoolers, 2 days on every week, and then in-person schooling for elementary school kids, all of which is horrible.
Not only horrible,
but
to the extent that we let some schools reopen, we're playing with fire that we shouldn't be playing with, right? We had choices. They are being eliminated without our asking them to be eliminated or inviting it. And at some level, winter is coming. I mean, it just simply is, right? So, I mean, I'm speaking as if everybody lives in the Northern Hemisphere, which almost everyone does. But I know that there are some holdouts down there in Australia. And
if you're in New Zealand, well done. I should say, well done.
Actually, that was good planning on your part.
Yeah, well done. No, not the people who would chose to live there. I mean, the political structure that demolished COVID-19 in New Zealand.
Oh, well, I believe it was
done.
Excellent planning for everybody on the islands to be there, and then it was good planning of them to use effective governance to.
I do think you're giving the Kiwis more credit than they deserve.
All right. Now you're the one who's going to get canceled by
because I call
Kiwis.
them Kiwis.
Yeah.
Yes. We have a New Zealand friend. She calls herself a Kiwi. Okay.
Yeah. All right. But so here's the thing. You're going to start playing this game with schools, right? Not everybody in those schools, even the grade schools, is a kid, right?
Right.
B, okay, new petri dish. We got kids. Can the virus figure out how to infect the kids, right? Now, again, this just occurs to me off the top of my head, but I think a lot of what's going on with this virus would be well explained if it had leaked from a laboratory that was using, let's say, human tissues, right? Human tissues that had been engineered not to hit their Hayflick limits. That means special human tissues like tumor tissues, right? That have dysregulation of their epigenetic nature, which means that the virus would be in a chaotic set of cells and it would be learning how to infect different organs, because even if you took lung cancer tissue, it might be expressing epigenetic phenomena from other tissues like liver. So one of the things that might be true is, whose tumors you don't tend to see in laboratories as experimental material?
I got this one.
Do you?
Children.
My goodness.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I don't know how far this goes, but let's just say one possibility is
it's consistent.
It doesn't transmit outdoors because laboratories are indoors. It doesn't transmit to children because the tissues in question tend to be adult tissues. It tends to be, capable of jumping lots of boundaries because that's what you would train it to do in a serial passage experiment.
And this sounds verificationist, and we would want to, to test all of these, but these are predictions from the idea that this is a lab. This was lab generated.
They are subsidiary hypotheses that the nature of the epidemiology and the symptomatology is the result of training a virus in a lab, both intentionally and inadvertently because of the way lab techniques work. So for those of you who are still thinking, maybe it doesn't matter where it came from because we've still got to deal with it. No, it matters a lot where it came from.
It's going to evolve differently if it jumped from a bat or a pangolin than if it was created especially from tumor tissues that don't have Hayflick limits, which you mentioned, that being cells that do not have an endpoint that it could just keep replicating indefinitely. Those cells will act differently, and therefore viruses that can be transmitted via those cells will act differently than any other naturally occurring virus.
Yeah, and the fact is, even if this came from the wild, even if it came directly from a bat, somehow, by some means we do not know, We don't know that it did yet. And until we know that it did, you cannot shut down these hypotheses that suggest this may be a central player in the epidemiology and the other phenomenology associated with this virus. So we need to know. And if what we prove is that actually through some mechanism we don't get, it came directly from a bat, great. That would be really positive. But it's not looking likely, I got to tell you.